Hello London, welcome to a discussion on emergence of knowledge society in India. As you are aware, when you talk about knowledge society, we talk about the societal framework that is widely founded on mass production, mass dissemination and mass usage of knowledge for the generation of wealth and employment in the society. By saying so, we are talking about the societal framework that will produce knowledge not only for the sake of knowledge, it will produce knowledge as an economic product that will be linked to the creation of wealth and generation for employment of largest segment of the workforce. India, as we understand, as we know, is having a long-drawn knowledge-based past. It was widely appreciated that India will be one of the strong stakeholder of knowledge economy and knowledge society of the 21st century. But no society can transform itself towards the goal of a knowledge-driven society, ignoring the resources that is available under its command. Let us talk about a society that India inherited from the colonial ruler. When India got independence in 1947, it inherited a backward and predominantly agricultural society. More than 90% of the people are dependent on the agriculture. The agriculture society was widely segregated in terms of landholding between the big landowners, the absentee landowners, and also intermediary category of the landowners on the one hand, and the small peasant, sharecroppers, tenant and agricultural laborers on the other. In this society also, India experienced the presence of a huge number of artisans and craftsmen. Gradually, with the prolonged policy of colonial rule, those artisans and craftsmen, they become unemployed, and a big number of them either migrated to the urban areas in search of employment and joined the army of agricultural labor force gradually. So what you find, an enormous process of downward mobility, a huge number of rural labor force before the attainment of India's independence. When India got independence, immediately after independence, India adopted an elaborate land reform policy. And that land reform policy widely talked about ceiling restriction on the land, number one. Number two, that is distribution of surplus vested land among the landless poor. Number three, the tenurial security of the tenant, and it's also talked about land consolidation and grow more food, that is self-sufficiency in agriculture. India also adopted the policy of very quick industrialization starting from the first 5-year plan itself. It adopted an elaborate industrial policy from 1952 onwards. Simultaneously, what India adopted a socialist pattern of society, that is, it talked about centralized planning, it talks about nationalization of the banks, and ultimately it founded the economic journey based on what we call the mixed economy. So what we found, three important things were taking place: centralized planning with the idea to have a mixed economy that will have the philosophy of capitalism on the one hand, socialism on the other. Also, it talked about fast and rapid industrialization, and simultaneously talked about agricultural modernization. Within that, what we found, that is, over a period of time, if we look into till 1980s, the industrial growth of India was not very significant enough. Rather, India remained part agriculturally developed, and it became only partly industrialized, and industrialization started taking place only in the limited parts of the country. So what happened? Gradually India emerged to be partly agricultural and partly industrialized, and economy was stagnating till the middle of 1980s. So what happened in the whole process? There also simultaneously India experienced a fast rate of growth of population. So population became a huge liability, and those were widely reflected in the depleting resources, depleting of natural resources and of various categories in terms of land, the forest, water, and other varieties of the natural resources. With this whole growth, what India experienced in 2000, if we look into early 90s onward, that is when India got independence, it was having a landman ratio of 0.48 hectare per person. That is in 1951. Now in 2011, the landman ratio has declined to the extent of only 0.24 hectare per person. So what we find, the landman ratio of the people of the country has widely declined. If we look into this landman ratio in terms of household landman ratio, when India got independence, the per household landholding was roughly around 2.5 hectare. 2.5 hectare. Now it has declined only to the extent of 0.40 hectare per family. So what we find, the enormous decline in the landman resources. Then we find there has also been increase in the rural unemployment. That is, if we look into 1980s, the rural unemployment rate was to the extent of 16%. And today we find rural unemployment rate has quite increased. It is to the extent of 23 or 24%. So what is important, along with the increase of the rural unemployment, there has been phenomenal increase of marginal worker. What the marginal worker? Those who do not get more than 180 days of work in a year. Means half of the year, those who remain unemployed. In 1980s, there were roughly around 10.6% of the people belong to the category of the marginal workers. In 2011, their proportion of the rural population has increased, rural workforce has increased to the extent of 29.5%. What you find, a threefold increase, roughly around threefold increase in the category of this marginal worker. Then we find similar increase of the landless and semi-landless people, that those who are landless or semi-landless in rural India, we find they comprise, semi-landless means those who own land only to the extent of 0.04 hectare of land. They also come to the category of semi-landless. If we bring that, they also 40.2% people, rural population are landless. Now, incidence of marginal cultivators, those who own less than 1 hectare of land, they altogether comprise 75% of the rural labor force. Along with that, what we find, there has been enormous process of migration of the rural labor force to the urban areas. That is, 2011 census talked about that 35% of the rural population are the migrant population, and a huge number of them are migrating from the rural to the urban areas. If we look at the whole component of migration, that is from within the state and then also from outside the state, we take into consideration the same census report talk about that the 49% of Indian population are the migrant population, and 90% of them now migrate for the employment purpose. So what we find is saturation of the economy, rural economy, increasing unemployment and casualization of the labor force. The casualization of the labor force also takes place in terms of increasing number of the agricultural laborer and decreasing number of the cultivators. Now see, in 1981, more than 49% of the people engaged in rural agricultural activities were cultivators. Now they have declined to the extent of 24.6%. Agricultural laborers, those were only 19%, now their proportion has increased to the extent of 19 to 30%. So casualization of the rural labor force has also been another phenomenon. Now we find, along with this whole process, what has happened, there has been interpenetration of non-agricultural activities in the rural areas. Now it has increased from 1951, from 30%, now it is more than 45% of the rural population are engaged in the non-agricultural activities. Now, what we find, that is 2-3 things. Number one thing is that agriculture is stagnating. There is an enormous process of casualization of the labor force, declining of the land-man ratio, increasing quantum of unemployment, and simultaneously what we find, there has not been much of industrial growth in the country. So when it was widely thought of when India got independence, the Indian workforce gradually shift from agriculture to the industrial sector. So that was a silver lining of hope. It was widely thought about, but because of non-progression, rather because of failure of the industrial sector to accommodate those labor force, the stagnation in agriculture has remained to be a phenomenon, and the stagnation is continued with sustained poverty, unemployment, and also simultaneously the concentration in the rural areas with a huge amount of unemployability and a huge amount of poverty and unemployment. In this backdrop, when all those things, and simultaneously economic growth rate was quite slow. Economic growth rate in 1980s, even mid 80s, early 90s, it was less than 5%. And many of the economists like Kane, Raj, and others talked about that is a very conservative economic growth rate. They talked about the Hindu growth rate of economy. When all those things are taking place at the one hand, stagnation of Indian economy, simultaneously India also visualized that what kind of change is taking place in other parts of the globe. Other parts of the globe, especially in the developing world, there has been enormous proliferation of information communication technologies. There has been the opening up of the economic frontiers. The neoliberal economic force started coming in. People started talking about globalization. People started talking about revolution in the knowledge sector. In the Knowledge Commission and also the Planning Commission of India widely talked about and emphasized that and categorically mentioned that India, that is, we miss the industrial revolution, but we should not miss the information and knowledge revolution. Because if we are to look into and we have to think of India to be a superpower in the 21st century, and then India should not miss its entry into the knowledge, in the area of knowledge revolution. So that is one of the emphasis given by the Planning Commission and the Knowledge Commission. So by doing so, what we talked about, when it talked about in 2001, but the preparation started before that. Starting from 1991, the government of India started thinking of getting integrated with the world economic order. So it started shifting of economic arrangement. It accepted the structural adjustment program in 1990s. Means it widely accepted the path of economic neoliberalism, and it smoothened the process of direct investment, foreign direct investment, and in several sectors, including information and communication technologies, and enormous penetration of the private sector in education. Because when we are talking about knowledge economy and knowledge society, what is quite important is that knowledge society, it should have enormous trained and educated manpower. And they should be the flag bearer of a knowledge economy. That is one. Number two, it should have the capability of a trade that will go across the board, and also simultaneously it will have enormous command over the information and communication technologies. If we look into today now, starting from because that opening up of the Indian economy that started from 1991. Now, what kind of shift Indian economy has got, especially in the education sector and also in the IT sector? Because what kind of infrastructure we have got for the to welcome, to usher the era of knowledge economy in Indian society. When we got independence, quite important is that number of the universities in India was less than 100. Now in India we are having 914 universities and more than 45,000 colleges. and this is a huge number of expansion of the infrastructure of the educational arrangement in the country, especially of the higher education. Now what you find, the GER, when India got independent, GER, gross enrollment ratio in the higher education, was only to the extent of 4%. Now more than 28% people go to the doorstep of higher education. The GER in the higher education has increased. So also GER in secondary education. It has, now it is more than 70% of the student population belonging to that age group go to the secondary education. Now earlier we had only one framework of education, that the conventional higher educational arrangement. Now we are having the multifaceted higher educational arrangement, that is along with the regular system. We are having the open distance learning system. We are having the blended educational learning system. India is also having the MOOCs, the borderless education, and simultaneously we find the enormous proliferation of private investment in education. When we are talking about the private investment in education, putting everything together, if we look into the whole number of the universities and the colleges in the country, it is important to mention that more than 2/3 of the university and higher education pass out now, they come from the private educational arrangement in the country. So private education is playing a huge role to provide the space, to enhance the space, to smoothen the space for educational expansion in the country. Simultaneously, we find that there is enormous proliferation of the internet in the country. In 1991, it is perhaps, it was negligible. It is 0.01% of the population having access over internet. Now it is more than 54% of Indian population having access over internet, 92% of the population having access over mobile phone. So what we find, that there has been enormous proliferation of the infrastructure for education, enormous proliferation of the educational institution, also enormous proliferation of the information and communication technologies. Now along with that, what we find, India has enormous young population in its whole population composition, population structure. That is, we are having high concentration of the youth population in the population. 65% of this population belong to the age group of below 35 years of age. So what we find, there has been a high concentration of the young population in the population structure. Now what we find, that is, education has increased, higher education has increased, educational institution has increased, and also we find simultaneously there has been expansion of the infrastructure for information and communication technologies, increasing access. Now, and also a neoliberal economic framework. What is ideally required, that is already available. Now let us see what kind of transition our economy is going, and that is the fact we have to reckon with. That is how our economy is gradually shifting. As we told in the earlier part, that is, our landman ratio has declined. When the landman ratio has declined, we also talked about, that is, work participation, simultaneously it will decline to agriculture. In the period between 1971 and 2012 and 13, if we take a comparative picture, we find that that is 72.5% of total labor force was involved in agriculture in India. Now 2012 and 13, it is 48.9% now involved in agriculture. If we look into GDP, I mean, what is shift? A huge kind of a shift. It has shifted from 62% to 13%. The contribution of agriculture to GDP has sharply declined. Work participation in agriculture declined, GDP in agriculture has declined. Now, what is happening, that is, let us see in the industrial sector. Industrial sector has been very unsatisfactory development, as is widely mentioned by the Planning Commission, also National Knowledge Commission, that is, GDP, that is gross domestic product from agriculture, yes, it is increased. It is increased from 13.66% to 27.1%, and the work participation increased to the extent of 11% to 26.8%. Now, if we look into in terms of maybe it is doubled in both the cases, rather more than doubled. But this doubling is not sufficient, not efficient enough to take care of the transition of the economy to a new order that will take care of the issues of unemployment, issues of shifting of the workforce from agriculture to non-agricultural sector, that will take the issues of low rate of economic growth. Now, what is important that what happened to the service sector? That is quite important, that despite all limitation, that now service sector is producing more than 61% of the GDP. If we look into the GDP of today's, that is 2020 GDP from service sector, this year service sector, it is more than 64% of the GDP is coming from service sector, and it is accommodating roughly around 30% of the labor force. So what we find now, that is a kind of shift, it is taking place. Agriculture has declined, industry is stagnating, while there has been a shifting in the service sector. It is a quite phenomenal in the sense that if we were to look into the transition of the economy toward the knowledge sector is linked to the transition from agriculture and industrial sector to the service sector. If we look into the global economy of the developed world, most of these countries, the labor force are shifting from agriculture and industry to service sector. The GDP is also coming maximum from the service sector. If we look into the growth, look into agricultural growth has been to the extent of 4%, industry 7.6%, service sector it is 9%. So service sector growth rate has always been phenomenal and always increased. And if you look into the booming of the Indian economy, which was taking place in 2014-15 and also 16-17, we find that service economy, the growth rate of the service economy was in the double digit. So it is quite important that our Indian economy is gradually shifting towards a new direction. Along with this new direction, what we can confidently say that that is a new kind of momentum has taken place across the space. What kind of momentum? It has generated new avenues of employment and occupational diversification and occupational mobility of vast segment of the population. Because what we find, our rate of GDP, our gross enrollment ratio in the higher education has increased. When it has increased, obviously there will be more and more occupational diversification. They will need more avenues of employment. So we find there are the new avenues of employment, occupational diversification, and also occupational mobility of vast section of the population across the space. And simultaneously, what is important, that this new momentum has created fast movement of consumer goods, along with computer, the typewriter, the television, the radio, the mobile phone, the new machine, automobile, the fashion technologies, new messages, images and information from one part of the country to another, from urban to the rural areas, rural to the rural areas, urban to the urban areas, from one country to the another. So we find a new kind of momentum is taking place, not only in terms of employment and mobility, but also in terms of mobility of consumer goods across the space. And this has brought in a huge kind of a change in the employer-employee relationship, both in the rural areas and also in the urban areas. In the rural areas, what you find, that is that employment, which was widely linked to one-to-one relationship, landowners and the landless, now we find the landowners are linked with varieties of the other occupation, the transport, the fertilizer, the agro-business, and also rural laborer, part-time migrant laborer, part-time thelawalas, part-time the milkman. So multiple employer-employee relationship has emerged, and that has increased the choice of employment, increased the choice of livelihood. So what has happened? All together, all this momentum has given a foundation for the emergence of knowledge job and knowledge-related job in Indian society. So it has created a good variety of knowledge worker in Indian society. And this knowledge worker, however, if we look into this knowledge worker, they are the worker, they are giving a new momentum in the society. But it is to accept simultaneously that is, there's a knowledge-driven economic movement in the society. It has not been equal, it has been layered. layered in terms of caste, class and ethnicity, layered in terms of geographical space, in terms of metropolitan cities, local town and the village areas, in terms of level of educational attainment, in terms of one's migration and commutation from one part of the country to another. So what we find, along with this economic momentum, there has been an inequality, there has been a kind of segregation in the society, and there has been a continuity of the old with the new, and it has created a new kind of hierarchy in the knowledge society. That is quite sociologically important, that we have to look into what kind of social framework it has produced. What we find that it has created a variety of worker in the society. The emergence of the knowledge society in India, let us accept that first, it has not replaced the emergence of the knowledge industrial worker. Simultaneously, it has not replaced the agrarian worker. So what we find, a knowledge society has emerged from within the coexistence of the rudimentary development of industrialization and also segregated, saturated agrarian society across the country. Now let us, by saturation we means in terms of burden of unemployment, in terms of existence of poverty, in terms of huge quantum of migration from the rural to the other rural or urban areas of the country. Now, what kind of new hierarchy is created by the emergence of new momentum as pushed in motion by the knowledge society? We find at the helm of all affairs, we are having the core knowledge workers. It is not possible in this short time to list all those workers. We have given some of the names. This is not exhaustive, only indicative. We find the host of jobs are identified to be the knowledge job. Those are directly linked to the job of a teacher, researcher, bank manager, professional engaged in IT, in the banking sector, in the retail services, in the media, in the business processing, software, hardworking, engineers, the doctors, the entrepreneurs, the health worker, the estate insurance agent, the typist, the computer operators, the agricultural extension officer, the health workers. They must be they are dealing with the knowledge. They are dealing with the mental capability, because a knowledge worker is founded on the cultivation of the mind. That cultivation of the mind is more the cultivation of the mind, more is the mobility, and more is the possibility of getting a place in the upper echelon of the knowledge society to live in the category of the knowledge workers. Just linked to that, and what is important, that they experience a high degree of mobility in the knowledge society. At the second, quote to the close, they are not the core worker, they are linked to the close. They are also having the high degree of flexibility and a high amount of transition and mobility. And they are the people, they are also in a position to make more choices. They are the support service providers, the labor contractors, the transport providers, the electronics and electrical technicians, the office peons and others. What we find, a new kind of space is created so that these people, they are in a position to provide more support services for the expansion of the knowledge society. So what we find, economically they are also well off, they are close to the knowledge worker, and there is every possibility that they will be shifting by gaining more and more education and training to the category of the knowledge workers. But what is more important is that knowledge society has created a pyramid-like of structure. In the pyramid, it belongs to the core knowledge workers. At the middle of the pyramid, we find this quote to the link, those kind of service providers. At the bottom, the huge number, they belong to the manual workers. Knowledge society has set in motion for the creation of new kind of infrastructure, the infrastructure of new building, for metro trains, for the airports, for the shopping malls, for the IT buildings, for international business houses, new kind of infrastructure. So what we find, for the creation of the new infrastructure, there has been enormous demand of manual laborer. And the cheap pool of manual laborer, they are the migrant worker, come from various parts of the country and live in the slum areas or in the dilapidated areas in the city. They include the semi-skilled or the unskilled workers like the fitters, the carpenters, the drivers, the rickshaw pullers, the security guards, the mechanics, the unskilled manual workers of all sorts, the construction laborers whose quantum of activities had increased with the expansion of the knowledge economy. Actually, they predominantly experience a kind of a horizontal mobility, while the others experience a vertical mobility economically, that is from one stage to that of other. The manual workers, which is a vertical mobility, a kind of a horizontal mobility. In that sense, they are migrating from the rural to the urban areas, and also their mobility becoming the same economic level. From one insecure job, they are coming to another insecure job. So their mobility remained a kind of a stagnant kind of a mobility. So what you find, a new kind of phenomenon it has come that has created a new kind of hierarchy in the knowledge society. Now, what is important that along with the expansion of the culture, of knowledge-driven society, there has been a new kind of shaking in the Indian society. And what kind of shaking is that? A new kind of a socio-cultural milieu is in the making. What is that? We find the new waves in the making. That is it has already influenced the pre-existing pattern of socialization, pre-existing process of imparting education, the process of engagement with varieties of cultural practices, the music, arts, game, information, the networks, developing friendship, and also deciding a space of mobility in the society. So what we find, that is a new kind of a network has emerged with the interpenetration of ICTs and others, a kind of a space, or what we can find two things. One is that an amount of disembedded net with the pre-existing cultural pattern, a kind of a re-embedded net with a kind of a new pattern of cultural devices and cultural practices coming in the society. And within that, a kind of doing a friendship and a kind of a social networking and epistemic communities are emerging, especially for the digital natives. And what usually many of the journals and magazines and social scientists talking about emergence of Deshi JPs in India, and they have emerged to be the guiding force and guiding engines of Indian economy and culture. What you find within that, there have been the new generation, the new breed, what you call them, the electronic generation, the electronic credo. They are the highly adaptive, and we find also a moderate adaptive. We also a part of a shaky, sacrificial generation, that is the elderly generation, a kind of a cultural conflict and cultural adjustment taking place between these two categories of the people. Those who are the new generation, highly adaptive to the new technologies, and the old generation, they are either part adaptive or indifferent to this culture. So what we find, a new cultural milieu is set in with the with the arrival of a new society. So what we find, a conflicting condition of this emergence in this society. What are that conflicting condition we talk about? Though India has got a knowledge-based past, as you told initially, the foundation, the social foundation of this knowledge was neither mass-based nor inclusive in the past. What has happened, if we take into consideration it was having a knowledge-based past, India is traditionally founded on the caste order, and in this traditional caste, the upper caste were having and the only capacity to learn, and they were the flag bearer and the owner of this knowledge and disseminators of this knowledge. So knowledge production was not mass-based, it was quite limited, only one section of the society. But knowledge society, what has happened in India, knowledge society is taking shape in a pre-given society. So what we find, there is a lot of positive correlation with the earlier kind of social inequality, knowledge inequality that existed in the society. What is that? That is, higher the degree of available education, higher has been the penetration of knowledge economy, knowledge society culture among those population. Okay, so those who are already educated, those who are already having the higher caste and ethnic background, they are having a higher degree of interpenetration of the knowledge society culture and the knowledge economic potential. Now, it has been widely conditioned by what you find, that is conditioned by the high volume of swinging between swinging socially between tradition and modernity, culturally between globalization and modernization. Since the caste values, ethnic values and the traditional values continues, so what we find, there has been a swing, because the caste factor and also ethnic factor getting influenced with the influence of modernity, with the influence of globalization. So what we find, a kind of contradiction between the tradition and modernity continues in Indian society. And within that, what we find, that Indian society has emerged to be, part agrarian, part industrial and part knowledge based. Because till now 48% of the labor force are engaged in the agricultural sector. Around 68% of the people rule in the rural areas or in the agrarian economy. So what we find, Indian society has remained to be part agrarian. It has been part industrialized, because around 25% of the labor force dependent on industrial sector. Let us come to the around 30% of the labor force in the knowledge sector, and also but giving a huge kind of productivity, more than 60% of this, 62% of the GDP. So this society has evolved to be part formal, part informal, part modern, part primitive. It is part local, part global, part inclusive, part exclusive. So what we find, India now stand in the process of a multiple interactivity. This multiple interactivity has produced a varieties of social interaction, and that is redefining our social relationship in the society. So what we find, these multiple identities in our society, that is also creating a culture of new kind of a protest, new kind of legitimizing, new kind of passivity in the society. But those within that, what we find, this society creating a new kind of identity that is getting consolidated on the one hand, and also getting simultaneously deconsolidated on the other. So what we have to accept at this stage, that society of India now transiting towards the stage of a new social progression. That progression is widely conditioned by the arrival of knowledge society, but within that there has been a contradictory, at times complementary existence of varieties of identities, that is traditional identities and modern identities, local and the global identities, and also it has smoothened the process of mobility of one segment of the workers, and also horizontal mobility for another category of the workers. So this is the phenomenon for the emergence of knowledge society in India. Let us just have a quick recap what we have talked in this lecture. We have talked about that India is having a knowledge-based past, but its knowledge progression was not that fast as it is to be as per the parameters for the emergence of a knowledge society. However, in recent past, India has developed all the paraphernalia, all the infrastructural arrangement and that manpower to have a quick shift towards the knowledge-driven economy. And in terms of the indicators of knowledge-driven economy, India is having all potential in terms of high rate of educational expansion, high rate of penetration of ICT, enormous process of neoliberal economic globalization. India stands today in the threshold of a knowledge-driven economy. Thank you very much for being with us. Thanks for listening to this lecture.